The first game in the God of War series is one that will always have a special place in my heart. Not because it has amazing combat or story, I love it because on my first playthrough from start to finish I wasn't able to put it down, which only happens to me rarely. At first I didn't fully understand why this game had such a pull on me, but eventually I realized that God of War 1 in terms of gameplay is one of the most well-paced games I have ever played. In this video we're going to explore why that is. In the first few hours of the game I liked what I played well enough, but around 1/3 into it there was a turning point, a section I found so enjoyable that I really started appreciating how God of War was designed. That section was the Desert of Lost Souls. The Desert of Lost Souls is a large area with a raging sandstorm that makes it almost impossible to navigate. Instead I was told by a supporting character to wander around and listen for a siren's song. Once I heard it I was supposed to follow the sound, find the sirens that it came from, defeat them and thus open the door to the next area. This seemed to me like a very neat idea. It was a little break after the more traditional combat sections I had encountered so far. The reliance on sound to guide the player was a creative and unexpected gameplay concept that felt fresh to me. Yet at the same time it didn't come across as gimmicky. In fact it blended seamlessly with a core gameplay, since once I found the sirens the combat against them was normal, and by looking around a bit I discovered a lot of hidden chests just like in any other part of the game. It was exactly what it needed to be, a twist on the familiar, a breath of fresh air. But looking at the desert section in detail, I realized the ingenuity went even deeper. The sirens themselves, on top of the audio gameplay twist, were a completely new enemy type that was being introduced within this very section. There were 3 sirens roaming the desert, and once I had fought the first one, the other 2 each spawned 2 minotaurs during combat. This was great for multiple reasons. Not only could I get acquainted with the siren's moveset during the first fight, I also got to see the new enemy type in synergy with an old one right after. By not having me fight 3 sirens one after the other, the game also cut down on repetition, instead opting to make the second and third fight more challenging. After defeating all the sirens, I then entered a room that totally surprised me. It housed a giant conveyor belt ending in rotating spikes. The trick in this room was to push a stone block to the other side of it against the conveyor belt's pull, because I needed it to make a high jump. However, there was a constant stream of monsters attacking me. This meant I had to kill the spawning monsters quickly enough that in between spawns I had time to make progress pushing the block. This room was another unexpected twist, but as before, one that didn't go too far. The base gameplay of pushing blocks and killing monsters remained intact. However, the conveyor belt's movement added a soft timer. It meant I had to give up trying to do stylish combos for a moment and instead be more efficient in my damage output, which was great. It taught me a new approach within the moveset I was already familiar with, all by creating a new type of arena. And then finally at the end of the section there was one more bit of combat waiting, a fight against 3 sirens at once. After having fought a siren on her own and then in combination with minotaurs, this was actually a very tough battle. The sirens themselves were much harder to deal with coming in a pack of 3, as they are very evasive and trying to hunt down one will keep you occupied long enough for one of the others to attack you from the side. The arena itself was also a very confined space, which made it harder to avoid them. It felt like a very fitting end to the desert part as a whole. So let's recap what exactly this part got right. After the initially neat concept of making me rely on sound to find my way, it first introduced a completely new enemy type. Then it varied up that new enemy type with old enemies, then it threw a completely new gameplay twist at me, and lastly it progressed the new enemy type to the conclusion of its difficulty curve by pitting me against 3 of them at the same time. This small desert section alone covers 4 very important gameplay concepts: the addition, the twist, the variation, and the progression. From a pacing perspective, every single one of these steps brought in some kind of new variable, and as a result the entire thing ended up feeling incredibly fresh and engaging. I wasn't bored for a second. Now what makes God of War 1 so great for me is that when I look at these steps that I just identified, they don't only apply to the desert bit, they can be found all over the game. The beginning chapters, for example, the boats in Athens, focus extensively on the addition aspect. The tutorial section alone introduces the 3 base enemy types: melee enemies, ranged enemies and flying enemies. It has puzzles, teaches Kratos' first spell and ends in a massive boss fight against the Hydra. In Athens, immediately afterwards, Kratos encounters Minotaurs, stronger soldiers, Cyclopes, shielded enemies, Medusas, Cyclopes with spiked weapons and Wraiths. Additionally, he learns 2 more spells in this section, which gives him access to 3 out of the total 4 spells in the game already, just a few hours into it. So right up front, God of War 1 adds an incredible amount of new enemies and tools, making sure that the player goes through many different combat encounters from the get-go. This works wonders for the pacing of the early chapters and makes the game entertaining immediately. And not only are all of those different enemies introduced, the principle of variation is applied as well to combine them in all ways imaginable. For example, after first fighting stronger soldiers, Minotaurs and Medusas on their own earlier, Athens then has a section in which the player is sent through a gauntlet of those enemies, all without healing chests. First he has to fight 2 Medusas, then 2 Minotaurs with a Medusa spawning into the fight a bit later, then a large group of stronger soldiers, and finally an extended rope section. Or take the battle in which Wraiths are introduced. Not only do you have to take on 3 of them in the initial fight, at the back part of the room there are also multiple archers firing at you. Once you've defeated that room and go upstairs, there are more Wraiths waiting, but this time they are accompanied by a spiked Cyclope, who, due to his tankiness and range, makes the fight much more complicated than the one before. So just in the first 2 chapters we can see the pacing principles of addition and variation applied extensively. Almost every room has something new waiting in it, and they are effectively used to keep repetition as low as possible. Another principle that the desert section showcased was the twist, in which a combat challenge has some kind of new element to it that changes up how you approach it. In the desert it was the constantly moving conveyor belt that you had to push something across. These twists can be found all over the game, and they are probably my favorite part of God of War 1. The conveyor belt room, for example. It was lodged between multiple siren fights and might have seemed like it was out of place, but in Pandora's Temple there is another room that calls back to this idea. Except this time, instead of pushing an object along a conveyor belt, you have to push it uphill while being attacked by respawning enemies. Just like on the conveyor belt, the object will still slowly glide back to the bottom for every second you are not pushing it, so the goal of killing the spawning enemies as quickly as possible is still intact. In another twist, however, this time there are little rock outcroppings on the slope that you can anchor the object in. The principle of progression is here as well, as the soldiers you are fighting in this room are much stronger versions of the soldiers you fought at the conveyor belt. So not only does this room have a new twist on what was already a twist in the desert, the game also mixes it up with new enemies to provide even more variety and more challenge. All the little ways in which this room built on the established core gameplay made it an incredibly entertaining fight. Then there are other clever gameplay twists, such as this section where there is a spiked wall coming at you and you have to eliminate an entire horde of enemies before getting impaled. Or this one, placed in a massive long hallway where you have to juggle killing both the strong monsters in front of you as well as the archers on the railings. Or what is probably my favorite room in the game, multiple side-by-side conveyor belts pulling you into different directions while both ranged and flying enemies try to stagger you into the rollers on each side. Again, what's so great about these rooms is that next to the more standard fights, they all ask you to approach combat differently. Sometimes you have to eliminate one enemy quickly, or use attacks that have a wide area of effect, or learn how to deal damage while constantly moving. Rooms like these are one of the main reasons why, despite the amount of fighting you do in this game, it never gets old. The designers of God of War implemented just about any idea you can think of to get as much out of this combat engine as possible, and I appreciate the creativity that went into this a lot. Even outside of combat, God of War makes it a point to regularly mix things up with puzzles, climbing sections or trap rooms. While these mechanically aren't as refined as the fighting, in terms of pacing they still help out a great deal. Rarely do they go on long enough to outstay their welcome, and instead they serve as light diversions, marking moments of downtime on your journey. The last 2 chapters of the game then, the Cliffs of Madness and Hades, are where the game noticeably ramps up the challenge. Here we touch on the principle of progression. In these parts, God of War introduces these goat demons that are easily the most difficult enemy in the game. It also starts sizing down most combat arenas, giving you way less room to maneuver. These sections also have the longest stretches without healing, as well as by far the hardest out of combat rooms, like these rotating pillars in Hades. Also, while the first 2 chapters of God of War 1 are entirely linear, and Pandora's Temple is linear but all within one dungeon, the Cliffs of Madness at one point actually fork the road, making you explore explore multiple paths to find 2 different amulets in whatever order you see fit. There's a very clear sense of progression present here. Everything the game has done up until now is, in terms of challenge, pushed to its logical conclusion, indicating that we are on the home stretch. It both raises the tension as well as motivates you to see the journey through to the end. So out of the established principles that gave the desert section such a great pacing, we have shown that the rest of the game carries them as well. The constant introduction of new enemies and weapons happens mainly, but not only, in the first few chapters. It keeps the game fresh by adding new mechanics and possibilities and by mixing them up. The manifold twists on the base gameplay in the middle chapter focus on testing certain skills within Kratos' moveset and on exploring the combat engine further. The last chapters focus on giving the hardest possible versions of all the challenges to ramp up tension before the finale, and mixed into all of these are the non-combat sections that regularly break up the fighting. There is an abundance of ideas in this game, and as I said before, pretty much every room is throwing something at you that you haven't dealt with before. Always surprising, but never overwhelming you. That is what makes the pacing of this game so good. If you look up the term pacing online, it is difficult to find a proper definition, but you get words like growth, development, and tempo. All things that God of War 1 excels at without ever having to overcomplicate its core gameplay. And that to me is an impressive achievement of game design. But there's one more thing that defines this game's pacing. One attribute that in my opinion takes it from great to fantastic. And that is the boss encounters. Up until this point you might have asked me, what about the other God of Wars then? Aren't they very similar games? Couldn't you say the same about them? And yes, they are comparable, but there is a difference. God of War 2 and 3 are sequels, and they do what sequels are supposed to do. They have more content, more weapons, and yes, more boss fights. 2 and 3 are built like normal video games. You play through a chapter, then you fight a boss at the end, move on to the next chapter, fight another boss at the end of that one as well, and so on. That's standard. God of War 1 does not subscribe to this structure, however. It has 5 very large chapters and only a total of 3 boss fights. The Hydra right at the start, Ares right at the end, and only 1 in between, the giant Minotaur in Pandora's temple. 3 bosses is a paltry amount compared to 12 in the second game and 8 in the third, and I'm pretty sure the larger number of boss fights for the sequels even was a selling point back when those came out. However, more isn't always better. I went into my first playthrough of God of War 1 with a specific mindset, namely that I was absolutely expecting a lot of great bombastic boss fights. It was a character action game, and character action games are supposed to have those. With the Hydra fight right at the start, it very much delivered on that too, and thus set up high expectations for the rest. But then came Athens and Pandora's temple. Hours upon hours passed with not a single new boss in sight. In the back of my mind, the anticipation kept building because I knew a boss fight was gonna happen eventually. The game just held me off every time I thought I had reached it. God of War 1 is actually so cheeky that halfway into the Pandora's temple chapter, it sent me through the room in which I would later fight the giant Minotaur. Just from the huge sealed door and the ballista in the room that didn't seem to have any purpose, I could tell right away that there was going to be something big happening in here. I just didn't know when or what. My anticipation for a proper boss became almost unbearable at that moment. All of this might sound like I'm criticizing the game for blueballing me, but I'm not. As we established earlier, God of War was very competent at throwing creative new rooms at me, and there wasn't a single moment in which I was actually bored. As a matter of fact, after prematurely sending me through this boss arena, it immediately confronted me with the next big sequence, the Challenge of Hades. A wonderful succession of trials in which it again brought many new ideas to the table. A new type of enemy was shown, introduced together with the concept of having to kill them within these narrow magic circles to sacrifice their souls in order to continue. Then I dealt with an enemy-filled maze, followed by having to dodge a never-ending stream of giant boulders and a long, difficult platforming challenge. I wanted the boss fight to happen, and in the back of my mind the tension was building up as it had been for hours, but I never had the time to actively think about it too much. Eventually, however, I unlocked the seal on the giant door and something started dramatically hammering against it. I made my way back, walked right in front of it, and finally the giant minotaur bursted through. Everything about this, including the visuals and the elaborate multi-phase boss design of the fight, was incredibly satisfying, specifically because I had been working to get to this point for so many hours. That is the game design lesson I took away from God of War 1. As long as the player has enough to deal with short term, there is no problem with long-term goals that take a while to accomplish. On the contrary, the long-term goal will end up feeling more significant once you reach it because it was allowed to slowly build in the background. No immediate gratification is required. I'm sure there are people out there who would say God of War 2 and 3 are more realized or objectively better than 1 just because there's more weapons and content and boss fights in them. But it was the lack of boss fights that elevated the first game over its sequels for me. In 2 and 3 the boss fights were good, but they were so numerous that getting to one of them lacked the same kind of impact. After doing some research, I'm still not entirely sure if the low amount of bosses in God of War 1 was a result of budget or time restraints, or if it was intentionally built this way. According to the wiki, however, there was at least one more boss fight planned in the room that housed the multiple conveyor belts. Remember the one that I said was my favorite room in the entire game? Yeah, who knows, this room could be worse or even better with a giant harpy flying around in it, but even with 4 encounters instead of 3, God of War 1 would still have way fewer bosses than its sequels. Yet that is one of its greatest qualities to me, especially because it has such an overabundance of ideas in other areas. God of War is a strong reminder that when it comes to a game's pacing, developing and introducing things is good, but showing restraint is equally as important. Bouken, signing out. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little breakdown of God of War 1. This is actually a video I've been meaning to do ever since I started the channel, and I'm glad I finally got around to it. I want to give a shout out to both Shintai Reviews as well as Corvus Analyzes, who really helped me refine this script. They are both great YouTubers with wonderful channels, and you can find links to them in the description below, so I really recommend checking them out. And if you want to see more stuff from me, then please feel free to like this video and subscribe to my channel as well. There are a bunch of other gaming analysis videos on there. You can also follow me on Twitter, where I'm very active. My Twitter handle is @BoukenJima_. And yeah, otherwise I hope to see you on my next video, and until then, bye bye.